Dr. Kenneth Pugh, who is the president and director of the Haskins Laboratories at Yale University. His research has been dedicated to understanding the biological basis of language and literacy, and he's done some phenomenal work in this field, including publishing one of the most influential papers on how the brain learns to read. So if you go back and Google Ken, you will find a number of his research publications. But what's very exciting today for this conference, for MGIP, and the discussion on the hub is what Ken's going to talk about today. So in the first of its endeavor and of the world happening right now, Ken is leading the way in bringing evidence-based strategies to reading in the classroom. So this is the dream of every neuroscientist who especially works on development, is to hope to translate the work that they do into classroom and society. Okay? So Haskins Laboratories has partnered with AIM Academy to create a language and literacy innovation hub, an international and interdisciplinary collaborative that brings together researchers, practitioners, educators, and educational technology specialists to deliver on the promise of neuroscience-guided reading instruction and remediation using education technology. Without further ado, ladies, I hand you over to Dr. Kenneth Pugh. Please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay in the back? First of all, I want to thank the MGIEP group for inviting me to this amazing conference. I've learned so much, and I continue to be inspired by the opportunity for people from different fields to come together to make really important changes in the world. And this institution and this organization is doing amazing work. It's also great to be here with one of my dear friends and collaborators, Dr. Nandini Chatterjee Singh, who we've published papers together on how the brain learns to read in English and Hindi and what's universal. And I'll sort of show that briefly as I go along. But as Nandini said, what I'm here to talk about today is the promise and the current state of using cognitive neuroscience tools to better understand how children learn, why some kids struggle inordinately with different kinds of learning, for example, specific reading disability, which both Nandini and I study, and how that information that comes from the brain research can actually help to understand individual differences and how to tailor treatment to the brain. Now, everybody talks about brain imaging. Wow, it's really cool. It's exciting to see. You'll see lots of brain pictures. But just because you can take a picture of the brain doesn't make it good science. And much of what we've done so far in brain imaging is laying a foundation. I'm going to go through that foundation for you. The first question is, in the area of reading and language, which I study, how does the typically developing child build circuits that support fluent reading? 1. 2, how do those circuits differ in children who struggle with language difficulties that are either environmental or congenital or usually both? And 3, the major $64,000 question, knowing where brain differs, how can we use effective treatment to moderate or change those differences? And that's a lot. We've made progress as a discipline in answering those 3 questions, and I'll share that briefly with you. But there's more we need to do. And what I want to submit from the outset of my talk is this, that the ability to peer into the circuits of the brain provides an exquisite sensitivity to individual differences that are sometimes not available in standard testing behavior. For example, 10 children might struggle with phonological processing, which is at the heart of most reading disability. But the process of operating on language, on phonology, involves lots of brain circuits operating on the order of 500 milliseconds, passing information around. 2 children might present with similar problems, but one might have compromise in areas involved in representation of language, another one in areas associated with access and retrieval, and yet another child in the ability to use that information to make decisions. And when we give the four children a treatment, two of them respond really well and two don't. But if we can understand mechanism deeply, and this involves not just mapping the brain, but diving into gene-brain behavior connections. I won't talk about this today, but we're currently in my lab doing a lot of work where we link genetics and a new kind of neuroimaging called magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which allows us to actually peer in to examine the neurochemistry of the brain, the balance of excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. In any case, we're looking to dive more deeply into the mechanism where the promise of neuroimaging and neuroscience is this exquisite sensitivity to what makes one individual different from another. And so we can hope and plan and fight to be able to reach a point where we can actually deliver on the promise of neuroscience, which hasn't been fully delivered on, to let the brain understanding tailor the treatment to the brain. We all want to do this. I want to show you where we're at and in the process. I focus on language and literacy. I focus on how the brain acquires written language. And I want to remind you of something. The human brain has evolved over a very long period of time a great deal of specialization for listening and speaking. Children, babies don't need to go to school in order to understand the difference between ba, ga, and ba. But they need to be stimulated. They need to be given beautiful, intensive attention, lots of language stimulation so that the statistical learning algorithms in the brain can kick into place and that child will be a listener and a speaker. And there's a whole lot of left hemisphere, it's more complicated, but especially left perisylvian tissue circuit that has evolved for talking and listening. But written language is a relatively recent invention. It's only been around for 5,000 years. So certainly there cannot be brain specialization for reading. So when people like me or Nandini or Greg show you maps of reading brains, we're talking about a brain that has to solve a puzzle. How do I get from vision to language in the most efficient way? Because the premium in skilled reading is the ability to look at the word and decode it in the matter of a few hundred milliseconds. If you can't decode each word fast and automatically and build brain connections that support that, then by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you will be struggling. And children with specific reading disabilities struggle at the level of building these efficient connections that make word reading automatic and nearly instantaneous. So, many children don't read well around the world. And you know these statistics, especially those of you who work in NGOs. There is a global literacy crisis. And that those children, even in my country, there's a disproportionate number of kids who read poorly who end up with very negative socioeconomic outcomes, higher rates of imprisonment, higher rates of social-emotional problems, certainly economic outcome difficulties. And importantly, there is a very clear link between health and public health and literacy. So one of the reasons we developed this global initiative was to be able to address the global literacy crisis. Now, for the vast majority of kids who struggle with reading, it is in the developing world, it's lack of access. This is where EdTech and all the things being talked about here can do beautiful work. But for significant numbers of children in all languages that have been studied to date, reading is also more difficult because of essentially brain-based differences, differences in how brains are organized that make some skills really easy, but literate language reading really hard. And this occurs in 5 to 10% of kids. It's persistent into adulthood. It's universal. And it is something that will compound and add to the challenges of reading and the challenges to educators. No matter where you are, you're going to be dealing with a percentage of kids who struggle from factors that are not just environmental but are also congenital. And we need to be able to understand these and, as I said, try to develop treatments that are tailored. So we developed something called the Haskins Global Language and Literacy Hub that Nandini alluded to. And we put together our people that already have connections to Haskins Laboratories, which is known as an international resource in the United States. We have research collaborations in 35 countries. So there's a long history of these kinds of connections. And we have a couple of target goals. Improving early assessment. Let me be very clear. Learning to read, as you'll see in a minute, doesn't start at the age of 5. It starts when you're a baby. And I don't mean you teach babies to read, but you give babies the extensive, beautiful language exposure, the vocabulary building, the phonetic structure that allows literate language to map into those areas at the appropriate age. We're interested in using ed tech to facilitate evidence-based practice, and we're interested in working in respectful partnerships with educators and researchers, not researchers telling educators one thing or educators telling researchers another, but solving these problems together. The team itself, this is the key leadership of the team. Many of the people whose pictures are on here come from a variety of fields ranging from genetics to education to cognitive neuroscience. We also have, representing India, of course, Dr. Chatterjee Singh, and a number of people ranging from genetics to neuroimaging. Our goals are obvious and the same as everyone here. We want to improve global literacy rates, we want to prevent literacy failure, and we want to explore the possibility that digital tools can be helpful. Our approach is rooted in the brain, in taking neuroscience and developmental neuroscience, birth to death, and using it in conjunction with ed tech and what's called implementation science, which is best practice in the classroom. And having those three things be fused and linked to one another. And we take this developmental perspective very seriously. So we want to understand success or failure in reading and how to improve outcomes. We have to look back at the earliest neurobiologic and environmental factors. Environment and genes and brain networks can produce a risk that can create a negative spiral that leads to poor literacy outcomes. We all know this. We want to be able to do a few things. We want to understand the emerging circuits in brain that put children at risk using these latest tools from brain imaging that I'll show you in a minute so that we can be predicting and preventing failure. Every one of us who does work with dyslexia would rather not be doing treatment. We'd rather be doing prevention. And prevention has to start in preparing the brain for literate language reorganization early. We also want to be able to deliver on this promise that everyone here is talking about and all of us struggle to really do right. Let the brain knowledge, the understanding of mechanism, actually drive the learning itself. It sounds great. It's hard to do. Let me show you how we're trying to approach it. First of all, let me give you a very brief look at the current state of neuroimaging. As I said earlier, the brain has a great deal of left hemisphere specialization for talking and listening. Babies are wired to speak and listen. We are not wired to read, most certainly. Reading involves taking visual information that impacts the visual cortex and finding the most efficient pathways that get you out of vision and into the mechanisms that you already have for language, phonology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics bloody fast. The goal, the premium, is to find connections that allow you to get from I to meaning fast. We use a variety of neuroimaging tools. I won't go into these in details. Most of you have seen them. And here's some of the work that we've done. First of all, to the point that good reading actually begins early. I just want to show you one study we published a few years ago in Brain, where we took children who were part of a longitudinal project that involved 4 languages, Chinese, English, Finnish, and Dutch. And we were watching these kids develop into fluent readers or not. We were trying to understand the genetic and neurobiologic factors. But we also had a significant numbers of children who very early on were what clinicians call late talkers. These are kids who did not produce oral language on time. Many of them underwent therapy. But we're now looking at these kids who are now learning to read. And many studies around the world have shown that late talking and early speech motor problems are a risk factor for reading problems. Not every child who's a late talker reads poorly. Not every poor reader was a late talker, but there's a strong relation. So we actually looked at this and we replicated at the behavioral level that children at age 7, when we had them in the scanner, who had been severe language impairment early on average were doing worse on all of our standardized assessments. And when we mapped their brain using fMRI, now in this image, the left hemisphere is on the right side. It's a radiologic slice. And what you're seeing is that even at age 7, these children who had early language problems are showing a rather intensively strong black hole in activation of the frontal basal ganglia thalamic language circuitry that's crucial for autoticity and learning. So good reading and risk for reading problems starts young. What is learning to read itself? This is a very important slide. Pay attention for a minute, and if I can walk you through this slide, everything else will make sense if I do my job. Okay. This is an fMRI study of skilled adult readers in English. No reading problems, no nothing. They're doing one of two things. In one condition, they read words, and in another condition, they listen to words. Duh, pretty straightforward. I am looking at how skilled readers create representations that bind oral and written language. The premium of skilled reading is to be able to leverage the machinery that nature gave you for talking and listening, for reading and writing. So if you look at the areas in red, that's the auditory cortex. Those are areas in the primary and secondary auditory cortex that respond to what? To words that you hear. In yellow, in the back of the head, in the occipital lobe, those are areas that respond to what? To the printed words only, because it's the visual cortex. But what happens in skilled readers is shown in green. And in green, this is just a statistical rendering. What you're looking at is that in skilled readers, areas that are involved in oral language, like Wernicke's area and Broca's area and supramarginal gyrus and other important tissue, is no longer caring whether the stimulus came here or here. In other words, skilled reading creates a binding. It creates a reorganization such that you're able to treat print as if it came to your ear, to put it in a silly way. And this turns out to be the single best predictor of reading outcomes. This was a study we published in Psychological Science about 2 or 3 years ago, where we took the children's brains at age 7 and we predicted read comprehension and reading at age 9, 2 years later. And the single best predictor was whether you see the green in Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And in other words, whether or not you're able to transform natural language systems into literate tissue. This was the single best predictor, reliable above all controls, even the autoregressor, and all, for those of you who do research, I'm sorry, I can't resist. And what about other languages? So this is a study we published a couple of years ago in 4 languages, in PNAS, Spanish, English, Hebrew, and Chinese. And the bottom line of this study was it didn't matter a jot whether you were looking at a very transparent language like Spanish, which is much more regular, like the Hindi akshars, or English, which is irregular, or Hebrew, unpointed Hebrew, which is very non-transparent, or opaque Chinese. This process of reorganizing this tissue, this binding, this creating a natural language structure that literate language can sit on top of, is the key to success in all these languages. And this is studies that have been done in the NRBC, did I say that? NBRC, the National Brain Research Center, one of my favorite places. and which have also seen this, studies we've done together and others, showing this universality even in children who are biliterate. As Nandini often mentions, children in this country need to learn many languages, and that's a strengthening of the brain. Okay, so what do we know about dyslexia? Let me speed this up a little bit. Dyslexia, first of all, we have to start with definitions. Dyslexia is not intelligence. So some smug, arrogant person who says, well, dyslexic kids, maybe they're lazy or not so smart. That is absolutely untrue. Intelligence is orthogonal to reading disability. Literally, there's no statistical relation. You could be a genius and be dyslexic. You could be average and be dyslexic, or you could be below average and be dyslexic. So these bright, beautiful kids are not lazy or stupid. But they have a difference in brain that can produce some advantages and critical disadvantages in making that map, in transforming language tissue so that you can get from vision into it bloody fast. It occurs across the full range of abilities. It occurs in all languages. What do we know about dyslexic children? This is a study. I'm just going to give you a flavor of this as I get close to the end of my time. This is a study we did some years ago at Yale and in my lab, where we looked at 144 brains, children, in a scanner between the ages of 7 and 17. Half of them were non-impaired, typically developing, and half were dyslexic. And the most important point is that the typically developing kids, here the left is on the left, as they went from being beginning readers to automatic readers and they began to change that speech area into literate tissue, they also began to develop specialization of a region that Greg talked about the other night called the visual word form area. So the higher the reading ability, the more you develop specialized tissue that allows rapid mapping from vision to language, an area that happens to live in an area that's very good at pattern recognition. But in the absence of treatment, look at the dyslexics. As they go from 7, 8, 15, they go everywhere and nowhere. There isn't that pattern of developmental trajectory. So here's the $64,000 question. Can brain imaging be sensitive to whether treatment works? And the answer is yes, unequivocally. This is a study, we did one of the original studies in this. We tracked kids for 3 years, pre-treatment, 12 months of treatment. Good treatment, by the way, for reading and language is phonetic, it is language-based, and it is following your grandma's rule. Practice, practice, practice. I have a colleague here, Margie Gillis, who's sitting in the front. We've worked together. She is an expert at how to design curricula and treatment for kids that are evidence-based, that are phonics-based. What we did, we silly brain guys, all we did was look at the brain pre, post, and 1-year follow-up. Now, in that slide, I couldn't flip it. The left hemisphere is on the left side. And what you're seeing is that children responding to treatment are actually gaining in all of the major components, especially the visual word form area. So when treatment works, the brain changes, as it should. Have we done our job? Have we answered everything? Should we go home and celebrate? No. Because what about the fact that many kids don't respond? The real promise of neuroscience and what is driving this global initiative that I'm going to end with is the ability to tailor the treatment to the individual. Most kids respond to treatment, but not all. In the case of our study, 75% responded pretty well. 25% did not. There's absolutely no reason to be saying we've done something unless we can reach those kids, those more intractable cases. So the promise of neuroscience is that it can provide insight into what works for whom and why. And we're currently doing 2 large NIH studies that we've now moved into the AIM project that Nandini talked about. The big questions are, do brain responders change differently during intervention than non-responders? How does the brain change with intervention? How does the brain change at different points in intervention? And finally, what are the predictors of brain change? Now, let me just tell you something. If any of you have worked with children with learning difficulties, you know this. Treatment is never like this. The child gets better every single day. what happens is you practice and you work with child, and they're flat. And all of a sudden, a light bulb goes off during treatment, bing, and they start to move. If I'm looking at the brain pre and post, I can't see that light bulb. That light bulb at a neurological level involves probably changes in control systems, working with language and visual areas, and reinforcing functional connectivity, which is the degree to which different tissue works together. So in order to see that, we need to image the brain consistently over the course of treatment. So the two projects are done, one in Atlanta and one in Connecticut, and now we've mapped these into the school projects. We use a combination of in-school evidence-based treatment. This is a program developed by Maureen Lovett that has been very effective in treating reading and is easily applicable to other languages. We're also working with an EdTech component, GraphoGame, which has been very helpful in bringing the grapheme phoneme learning to the lab and to the school. This is just a general finding, replicating what we've done in the past. You see that area that I talked about, that language tissue? We see no activation there pre-intervention, and on average, among 80 subjects thus far, we see that when the treatment works, we get the brain change. But we've already done that. I need to understand the differences. Use brain imaging to get at individual differences. And so this is an example. We can separate the kids into responders and non-responders and ask what it was at the beginning and what it was at the end and during that gives us key insight into those kids. And we're getting all kinds of new insights now in why some kids respond and others don't. There's a lot of science I can't possibly summarize, and I'm out of time. But we're also doing the frequent imaging using a combination of MRI and optical imaging called NIRS, and we're doing it over the course of treatment. This is a data point from one of our subjects, is illustrative, a child in the school who is undergoing this intensive 80-hour treatment. And what you can see is the connectivity between Broca's and Wernicke's is sort of flat at the beginning, and all of a sudden that light bulb goes off and the child starts going up. Now some kids go up earlier, some kids go up later. The promise of neuroscience is in understanding why, who these kids are, and then to move to the final new directions, my last slide. We need to be able to leverage the co-creation with schools, as Nandini mentioned. And actually bring the neuroscience into the classroom. And our partners at the AIM Institute, the AIM Academy, and now another group in New York at the Windward School have agreed to let us bring neuroscience into the school. And cheap neuroscience, not big MRI machines, which are impossible. But things like very relatively inexpensive EEG and NIRS caps, so that we can work with kids and understand how they're learning, how they're responding to treatments. And we're, again, working with bringing these technologies into the school. I want to mention 3 areas very quickly that we're doing that are very exciting, cutting-edge neuroscience. And we're doing it in the in-school project, the one that Nandini and I were talking about. One is called hyperscanning. The human brain does not live in a vacuum. It lives in relation to other brains. And my colleagues at Yale, Joy Hirsch, and her team have created a setup where we can take the same 2 children in communication, put caps on them, and look at the degree to which one brain interacts and correlates with another. There's an extraordinary thing that happens. If I'm actually understanding you and you're understanding me, my Broca's and your Wernicke's become correlated, literally. Okay? And to the degree that the education program is effective, it should be creating that parity. And so we can't just look in the brain, we need to look at the social brain. And frankly, when we look beyond that, this is an example from a very good group at NYU where they put caps on the entire classroom and the teacher to get a sense of whether different programs are able to get kids more or less entrained to teacher. What does this mean to all of you? Simple. Use these tools to get new insights into how children learn and how to design a classroom that can optimize brain development. This is a beautiful example of the future. And we also are using real-time imaging. I need to end. So we need to be linking EdTech and global partnerships, neuroscience, early development and early identification. And for those of you who don't know what the heck I'm talking about because you're computer scientists, here's what I need from you in EdTech. 3 things. We already have some good technology like GraphoGame and others for reinforcing learning to read. We need to expand that across all the world languages. We're working on that in my global hub. But there's not any good EdTech for preschool. So I'm starting a project in the US looking at children with cochlear implants. And these kids are at elevated risk for all kinds of literacy problems if they're not given good preschool language. We really need better EdTech. That you don't want to teach a 3-year-old to read. That's ridiculous. You want to teach a 3-year-old to become rich, a language professional, so that the brain's ready to learn to read when it needs to learn to read. And this is an area that EdTech really needs to work on. One of my colleagues at Yale, Julia Irwin, has developed a face and audio system to train articulation in children who are deaf or autistic or at risk for dyslexia. And finally, last, we need to have EdTech that goes beyond reading. Here is what happens when you treat reading in 6 or 7 or 8-year-olds. You can often fix decoding, but somewhere around 4th grade, when they have to go from learning to read to reading to learn, the system begins to get fragile again. And it's critical that we have technology that can reinforce not just learning to read, but the 21st century skills. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ken, for a fabulous talk as always. I'm now going to invite Dr. Sorrell Roy to introduce our next keynote speaker. I've elevated you to doctor.
Disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. It's my real pleasure to invite this dynamic entrepreneur with 20 plus years of experience who has a very deep background in building capacity and exploring the role of AI to see how the global skill mismatch can be addressed, what can be done right from the school level, and what actually gets across to when they reach to the stage when they are supposed to get jobs. So please put your hands together to welcome Harry Kitmo. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. We are in the middle of the 4th industrial revolution, namely automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and digitalization in general is taking over, which means also we are in the middle of, does my clicker work? I hope it does. Do I have to point in specific location? No, thank you. We are in the middle of also reskilling or upskilling revolution, because our challenge is that when our working environment changes so rapidly, we have to reskill, and that's not only for one report. We have thousands of different kind of vocational, professional, even basic skills reskilling, what we should learn. And everything is because our work is changing, our environment is changing. And that's nothing new. That had happened a long time before. First industrial revolution in 1750. Also jobs were lost. Also new skills has to be learned. And many times since that. But the speed and the size of this change is big. And in fact, if we take the newest estimations, 4th industrial revolution, or should we say artificial intelligence and robotics and digitalization, it's approximately 85% of labor force that should get new skills. And I highlight, no new degrees, not new education, but new skills. And that's completely different than going back to school and starting something from very, very beginning. And the second big question, do we lose jobs? Yes, of course. But it's wrong word to say, do we lose jobs? Because all the time during mankind history, we have given, or we have taken machines to do dangerous, dirty, or otherwise unpleasant tasks. And at the same time, the productivity goes higher, and there will be new jobs. But the only challenge is how we can predict the new jobs and how we can prepare people with the skills that are needed in the new jobs. And that is our real question. We shouldn't ask questions that how we can avoid jobs being lost for machines, because that's obvious. It's going to happen. We have to ask, what skills do we need to train? And that's for 5 billion people in the world, 85% of the labor in the next 30 years. So it's remarkable. And the unpleasant truth is, if we don't know what the skills are, and we are doing training activities, they are most likely wrong. So that's why we have developed an artificial intelligence solution that is a combination of natural language processing and cognitive reasoning that can understand from natural language the labor processes, so the labor analytics, individual skills analytics, combined with educational needs. But starting from very beginning, the smallest unit is microskill. So it's not like engineering or nursing or something. It's small, like addition or welding metal or ironing fabric. So very small skill. And when our AI can read, for example, job openings or job descriptions or forecast reports in labor markets, it can start to build an understanding based on big data globally. What skills are needed right now? What skills are not needed anymore? What kind of topics are trending up? So there might be something in a couple of years. And I have to say, forecasting is always difficult, so there is a factor that we need also human. But reading several job openings, putting them together, we can build an understanding what kind of skills are needed in certain time, in certain industry, in certain area. For example, here, what Finnish construction industry need in May 2018. And here, for example, what Delhi software industry was seeking last month. And what more green, that more the skill is searched after. And what less green, that less the skill is needed. We can also take a list of downtrending skills, so skills that are not searched anymore. But our AI can't make decisions. It is, in that way, it is just a tool. It can collect a huge amount of data that people can't. It can visualize and put it together. But all the discussions have been done by domain professionals. So what this means? That's human work. How it is built and how the data is collected, that machine work. So we still need domain professionals who are context and culture aware and so on. But okay, understanding the labor market's dynamics is only the beginning. Next thing is what education is doing. Because we have that much degree programs, we have online education, we have private training, and we should understand what we educate right now. So we can do exactly the same. Let the machine do mind mapping and put the maps together. And now we have, for example, in my example, what we educate in Finland in vocational schools for everyone, that construction industry is seeking. And what more green, once again, the more we educate the desired topic. And we can see that the Finnish vocational school educates approximately 30–40% of everything that is searched in the construction industry. And I would say that's good, because no school system can do all. Vocational school, the professionals working in the construction. We need also engineers, we need managers, we need completely the accounting and administration part on construction industry. So no school can do all. But we have to have the data for people to have something to discuss with. And okay, final, what individual people know or what skills individual do have. I think most of us do have LinkedIn account where we have our job titles and what we have done previously. Because our AI already knows what job title is connected, what kind of skills, what degree program brings what skills. Converting your CV to skills is quite trivial. Of course, for human it would take a couple of hours per CV, but for machine, less than a nanosecond. But when we have converted my CV to skills, we can see for what is my fit to, for example, construction industry. And my example is my CV, so I have some fit because of my background. But if I won't have a fit, there won't be no green. But I would say more interesting is that in what domains or what industries I fit best. And if we put my data in, for example, industries I fit and what skills I already have, and extending with some other skills, I'm still very good in this industry. So bringing everything visual helps individuals to understand that no matter if the machines are taking jobs, I'm still good in what I've been doing. And getting a couple of more skills, I'm still really good. Of course, the easy task is that when we have my profile as skills, we can easily check that what jobs are good for me. And because we have a quite big local, global data, we can check also in what areas or in what locations are jobs that might be good for you. But then the other topic, because it's very easy to lie on the CV, and also it's very difficult to assess by your own, so self-assessment, what I really know. We have used the similar or the same AI to construct basic level assessment as well as curate basic level introductory courses. So idea is that our AI, when it is doing this labor markets analysis, it builds mind map about every topic. So basically, there is a mind map already done for all the topics it has recognized as a skill in labor markets. And this mind map is basically a curriculum, because in curriculum, it describes what we are going to study, what are the core concepts, and into what extent this course is going to be. This is a curriculum. So we only convert it, or the machine converts it, into visual form. And these courses, AI-done courses, AI-made courses, can be integrated, for example, into Moodle or any learning management system that takes external API calls in. There is a similar mind map, now a bit more visual form, because the graph form is interesting only for mathematicians, but this is for everyone. So basically, every block represents one concept in the mind map. And this is also a course structure. We can curate content from open educational resources to fit every topic in the course. And we can also put the course in chatbots. So basically, what our AI do in educational side is pretty much the same what we have always done in e-learning. But now we don't need a human designer in between, which means lower costs on producing courses that has to be done now. So we can just go immediately further. And the assessment part, because the mind map is there. Mind map, we have done a lot of research to make sure the mind maps are valid. But when we have a mind map, the AI can start to make questions like how concepts A, B, and C are related, and establish an open-ended question on that. We type an answer, and the AI analyzes the answer and builds a mind map about it. And if the mind maps are pretty much the same, you are done. If there is no matching in the mind map, no points. And if it is somewhere in between, let's take a next question. And the same with a bit easier form, because writing is sometimes difficult for some people. And once again, it doesn't have anything to do with intelligence, but writing might be difficult. That's why also a bit more complex multiple choice, like, oh, this is in Finnish, had to translate. Which of the following words are related to welding? And I have 12 words. I have to click on what might be related, because that shows I'm conceptually aware. Is gas related to welding? Is heat related to welding? And so on. So if I can check the right concepts and leave not to check the wrong concepts, I'm conceptually aware of the topic. And so I get points. I get more green into my map, so I have shown that I know those skills. Doesn't mean the same that we are doing it at the school, but this is definitely better than nothing, or just self-assessment, where some people say that, okay, I'm mastering everything, and some very self-critical people say that, I don't know if I know this. But the idea is to make everything easy, automatized. And so finally, if we think the reskilling challenge, it's not only to putting more and more effort into educating something that we have done for the last 40 or 50 or 100 years. The critical thing is to first understand what skills do we need. And because the prediction is difficult, we don't have all the skill names even now. We have to accept that changes are fast, the names come in fly, and all the predictions might change in 3 years. But if we don't even try to build that understanding, we are going to fail. So, building understanding about labor market dynamics. Then second thing is build individual skills models which are detailed enough to answer question what individuals really know. So the title like I'm engineer doesn't tell too much, or I've been working in electrical engineering industry. Doesn't tell too much. We have to have user models that are extensible, flexible, and compatible with all the other data we have. So with that we can show career path, direct jobs, but what more is that what skills we need in order to get next or better job. And of course, if there is no education available, we have to somehow be able to provide at least a curriculum playlist or some educational playlist and be able to assess the skills in order to make sure we know at least conceptually somebody is aware on something. And basically, that's our framework, how we are bringing artificial intelligence to help the reskilling challenge. And we can't do this alone. We are developing Justice AI part. So I invite everyone who is interested to take our AI to real work in your own needs to discuss with us, because we have to do this together with all the players in the industry. Thank you.
Just because we are running short of time, just one quick, precise question. If any one of you have, we could take that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, what you're talking about. So you talked a lot about the conceptual and hard skills required for the job market, but things like communication, soft skills, relationship, teamwork, I think they become critical as well in the economy. So how do we do that using?
Thank you. Very, very important topic. So in my talk, I was only talking about hard skills, because hard skills are easy to measure, and for artificial intelligence, they are easy to recognize from the data. But there are way more important skills, like transferable skills like critical thinking, complex problem solving, or so-called soft skills. I don't know if there's a good word, but soft skills like communication, collaboration, and so on. Those are really critical things. But in our approach, we have to say that these are skills that are taught by human to human. And that's why I think, and in our approach, we think that that is for K-12 education, that for academics, and that's a, let's say, general literacy that should be done by formal educational system and should be part of our everyday life. So, want to highlight, we are not saying that the transferable soft skills are not important. No, completely different way. They are the most important skills we might have, especially critical thinking. And then hard skills, they are just adjusting to make sure I get a job. But without soft skills or transferable skills, it's way more difficult. So thank you for a very important question. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hari. He's available the whole day today, and you would not miss him. So I would encourage you, they have done very deep work. He will be available in this area itself. Please find him and ask deeper questions and understand the work which Head AI is doing deeply. Thanks a lot for being such a patient audience. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, without wasting time, we're just going to jump into the very next session. And I'm happy to introduce Zigor, who will be moderating the next session on global guidelines. Zigor. Yeah. Take it away.
Yes, of course. Good morning. Oops. Yeah, gonna start. Just waiting for people to leave and set up and... Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here with us today to discuss, well, in this catalytic session to discuss a very important topic, probably one of the most important in this year's tech conference, which is guidelines. Digital learning is a very exciting thing. It's very exciting for teachers and parents and users and everybody concerned because it brings us the opportunity to invent and reinvent education and make it more compliant with the needs of the 21st century. It's also very exciting for investors because there's an increasing market and they can see that with digital learning. So Just to give you a few features, the digital games for education, the market for it is about $3 billion, or was about $3 billion last year, and is expected to go up to $8 billion, by 2022, I think. And the overall tech market it was estimated to over $250 billion in 2020. So this is a huge market. And the developers are very excited as well, because for them it's an opportunity to grab some of these investments done and make more money. So the result of this is that it attracts a lot of people and lots of kinds of people who develop all sorts of applications that are not all up to the task, and are not all, I regret to say, at the right quality. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to choose what are the good applications and distinguish the good applications from the bad applications from the ugly applications. And I think a lot of us, especially the ones who are parents, have already experienced the nightmare of choosing applications for their kids. I have a 4-year-old kid, and I had to spend, I think, months choosing the right application for him when I wanted to introduce him to the iPad and the new technologies and interactivity and all that. So there's a growing need or a growing feeling that we need a way to certificate the applications that are coming to the market, so that it's going to be easier for us to distinguish which are the ones that fit the needs, which are the ones that have good outcomes, verified outcomes, just like a little bit like when you go to a supermarket and you want an organic product, well, you have a very distinctive organic logo on it. And it prevents you from going through all the products and see all the ingredients to figure out the ones you want to buy or not. So doing some kind of certification for digital learning application, I think, is something that is really needed at the moment. So when you think about certification, the first step is establishing a set of guidelines that people will have to, or developers will have to comply with in order to get the certification. So this process of establishing guidelines is always a very delicate one, because a lot of people have to agree. So it's very easy to do very vague guidelines, because everybody will agree with these vague guidelines, but they're useless because they don't serve the purpose. But on the other hand, if you make them too strict or too complicated, nobody will go through the process of trying to comply with the guidelines, so they're useless as well. And this balance is always, in every case, very difficult to achieve. But we have two additional problems with digital learning. One is learning. One of the biggest challenges of learning in the 21st century is lifelong learning. So the guidelines have to encompass a huge, very broad scope from children age 5, 7, all the way up to adults that have already 1, 2, or 3 careers behind them, and for some reason want to learn something new because they need to, because they want to, because they have time and they want to learn something new. So learning is not only for kids, learning is for everybody. And when I say everybody, I mean really almost the whole population of the world, because you cannot limit yourself to one country or even one continent. The guidelines should encompass learning all over the world, in India, but also in China, but also in North America, South America, Europe, the rest of Asia. So it's really North Pole, South Pole, everywhere. So it's really very complete. The scope of it is really very, very broad. And the other difficulty in digital learning is digital. I mean, what today grows faster and evolves faster and more deeply than technology? I think nothing. So we need to, the guidance need to encompass technologies that we don't even know will exist in the future. And if it fails to do that, it will fail as well. So extremely complicated, more complicated than usual. And since I'm very lazy myself, I think it's my first and best quality I have, I had to wonder, is it really worth the effort? Do we really need guidelines? So I think this is the first question to ask. Is there another way to do it besides guidelines? So why guidelines? So we have with us in this fantastic panel Professor Vali Kumari, who's a teacher of computer science and engineering at the Andhra University, and Susanna Poak from this fantastic organization called Games for Change that promotes social change through video games. They can share their perspectives on what could encompass, what should be in these guidelines for them to be effective in the perspective of a teacher and with the perspective of somebody trying to change the world through digital applications and especially games. We also have two entrepreneurs with us. Avri Rib, or Rib, I hope I pronounce correctly. Thank you. So Avri has been teaching, if my memory serves well, 15 years, so as a teacher, and then I started his own company to develop games for education, which is Affordable Studio. And Santeri Koivisto from Finland, who is one of my favorite, well, one of my personal heroes, I have to say, because he's the creator of Minecraft for education. And I think it's one fantastic piece of software to learn. So they can give us that perspective as entrepreneurs because they will be using the guidelines before everybody else to develop their games. And last but not least, my other favorite personal hero, Dr. Kumar Duraipa, director of UNESCO MGIP and the man who had the idea of this hub, of this conference, and who's making it happen. So my first question would be for him. Why guidelines? And why guidelines and not something else? And why these guidelines?
Thanks, Igor. I thought you had it right when you were mentioning your first hero, and then I figured you still needed a lot of, wasn't sure whether you're still credible after the second hero. I'm sort of saying, so apologies for coming late. I thought I had got away from this panel, but apparently there was a change. So I was having coffee and having chats with a lot of very interesting people on the corridors, especially in particular a very young group from Finland, incubators, and they were giving me some new ideas on incubators. But here we are. Why the guidelines? Well, I think the idea struck in a sense, well, one of the fundamental mandates of UNESCO is a standard setter. We tend to do quite a bit in terms of providing guidelines across a whole broad areas that we cover, with, education, culture, science. But so that was more like in a sense of why UNESCO MGIP took this up. For the reason why we thought guidelines was that when we were looking at the landscape, we knew that digital pedagogies were, the size was growing exponentially. We saw some very good programs. Minecraft is one, and there are quite a number of others. But at the same time, there were some that we were a little bit concerned in terms of quality, what they were aspiring to say, that what they covered. And when we had our first conference last year, we brought together a multi-stakeholder group of policymakers, but primarily a lot of people from the industry. And I was a little bit surprised when they actually were very supportive of this idea of developing guidelines. I thought there would be resistance because it would be, the first reaction would be it's another regulatory framework. But they felt that that was actually going to support, because many of the players we brought were very, they were very keen on quality. They were suspicious in a sense of a lot of new programs, new courses that were being put up, but without really having the kind of research and underlying support for those kind of modules that they were being produced. Now, one of the things that I was a little bit concerned with guidelines is that that it should not be prescriptive. And it's a very fine line on being relevant but not prescriptive. And it's a mantra that we actually use in the science policy dialogues. And if you pick up any of the science policy documents, like even the IPCC reports and stuff, the first line would be, it's policy relevant but not policy prescriptive. Countries do not like to be told. And the guidelines have to be very, very aware of that. Otherwise, it's killed right from the start. But then we were thinking, so what would be some of the things that we were, so what are these guidelines to cover? And I'm going to leave the other members of the panel to allude to that. I think they're much more qualified than I am, working the field of gaming and digital pedagogies. I'll talk more from the science part, is to have the programs or the material that is being provided for education to have a very solid scientific and evidence base. And I was very delighted to hear when we were having the small discussion among the group from QBank that fraction split, was that right? Slice fractions. They told me I was dyslexic. I get things flipped. Slice fractions actually had a very, very systematic approach where they did pre-assessment, post-assessment, got an independent group, but you got an independent which was from the university, so a little bit of, so a lot of strong science driven, and to evaluate how successful it was based on a certain number of parameters, which I have a whole list here. There's a pedagogy, age appropriateness and learning outcomes, and the list goes on. So that was the whole idea of whether guidelines would be useful. We had this discussion at 2017 conference. There was overall agreement that we should go ahead. So we had this first high-level policy forum on the 14th of this, in this conference, where we brought member delegations delegations from member states, not the 193 countries, but a small fraction, but these are members who are on the executive board, which means the decision board of UNESCO. Surprisingly, again, many of them were very supportive of it. My first approach was to bring it to the attention, get a group of experts to develop the guidelines, and then we would just present it to the member states, but nothing more. But the countries actually wanted a much more rigorous approach. They wanted a draft resolution to UNESCO, which is a lot more of a, I'm not sure, I'm sure many of you don't really understand, or not understand, but be aware of the complex convoluted minefield, I call it, of political negotiations to get something like a resolution passed. 190 member states have to agree. So I was a little bit concerned that we were going to go to that part. I was trying to take the easy way out because the beard is going white. And with this process, most probably the hair and the beard will turn completely white because it is a minefield. And we're going to see how it goes. But I was very happy that those member states were very supportive of that. And I have the mic. I want to make a plea to all the candidates out, participants out here, to please go on the guidebook and sort of, because there is a thumbs up for the declaration, we would like your thumbs up for the declaration. The high-level policy forum, which was about 50 to 70 members, delegations plus stakeholders, have approved it. We would like to have the support of the whole conference participants when we take this to UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananta. Maybe, Vali, you would like to tell us what you expect from these guidelines in the perspective of a teacher that's going to ultimately probably use these kind of applications.
Yes. So after Ananta quotes why the guidelines and how we have reached till this point, I would like to supplement. Yes, guidelines are required because you need to show all the stakeholders the direction, because ultimately it's all about achieving SDG 4 and provide quality education for all. Well, this digital learning tool or tools or material or resources, when you talk about, all of these, they encompass the content, be it visual, be it animated, or graphic based or game based. All the content plus some practice items plus some assessments, all of them packaged together for a particular learning objective and a few learning outcomes. So definitely there have to be guidelines and a certifying system for which these guidelines should form a basis for. Well, when compared to textbooks, digital resources are definitely different in various ways. Right from instruction methodologies to personalized content, to the learners, the way they learn, the teachers, how they teach, the scale and the reach of this digital material to the masses, and the accessibility of the content to the learner, like which learner has to target on which kind of material. So there are a variety of features that have to be studied upon when forming the guidelines. Of course, all of this across the globe, irrespective of the geolocation, the learning resource should be useful. Well, because the certifying systems have to be in place someday, as every now and then, you talk about today, maybe a few hundreds of video lectures might have got uploaded to the YouTube. Lot of learning sessions like this might have been uploaded to Facebook. Lot of digital content is available. But then who is certifying all those? Because everybody has access to that resource does it mean he can directly use that resource and gain the knowledge he could have gained if it was a certified material? Yes, in addition to this, so there are a lot of side effects for the material that is available on the web or through an offline resource in the form of an application software. The side effects could include health in the perspective of addiction. So once you start looking at a device that has got a software, be it interesting or otherwise, you get used to it so much that you miss your lunch or your sleep hours. So how do you put a restriction when a particular youngster or learner has started using this kind of a resource for learning purpose, enhancing the skills? So even health is important, and this kind of an electronic gadget, is it controlling the user from getting detracked and, we start browsing on the web for something, and after 1 hour we realize we forgot for which we started the browsing, and we ended up, surfing all the other resources that we come across. So how much of the time that we spend, in this process is actually utilized for the purpose it was meant to be? How do you control that? And how about personal, social relationships? That teacher touch, how much is being missed, is important. Like, how do we, see that still the social relationships, the peer relationship or the teacher relationship, they're still prevalent even after attending a study course through online media or digital media. Lots of things like this need to be considered while forming the guidelines.
Thank you, Vali. So you advocate for guidelines encompassing not only the outcomes, but also the graphic quality, health concerns, pedagogical strategy, the relationship between the learner and the teacher. So that's a lot. How do you feel about that, Ari? You as an ex-teacher and now a successful entrepreneur.
Well, I'm still actually a teacher. I still teach, and I have a game company, and I also do research on games. So I have a kind of a weird perspective on this because I see it through the different lenses. And one of the difficulties that I think that we have in this whole process, I think everyone wants guidelines. I don't think there's any, or I don't think there's that many people out there who do not want guidelines. I think there's a lot of positive with guidelines. It helps us make decisions. It's just a question of how can we get the stakeholders on the table to put those guidelines together so it makes sense, that there's not only that they make sense, but that there's buy-in. I think we were talking earlier about this idea of having someone making a decision for you. It's never fun, whether you're an adult or a child, to have someone make a decision for you. So how do we get everyone around the table to make or to make the decision collaboratively and then spread the message so that everyone kind of buys in? My specialty is a second language acquisition. I have been a second language acquisition teacher for 15 years. I make games, and I've done a lot of studies in this field. And one of the things that I notice is that none of those people, the teachers, the developers, and the researchers, they never talk. They never get around the table. They come to conferences like this, and they start to talk, and then they go home, and then the conversation stops. So second language acquisition has been around for 50 years. It's an amazing field with some of the most interesting studies out there, and they have a really clear set of best practices on how to learn a second language. It's not voodoo. It's not like kind of like art. It's a science. It says these are things you should do for a second language to learn it effectively, and these are the things you shouldn't do. The number of those best practices that are in classrooms today, not very high. I don't want to give percentage because I think that would just be a guess, but it is not high. It is not as high as it should be. And the same thing for the developers. Those who are making tools for second language acquisition, whether they be textbooks, educational technology, or games, game-based learning, they do not understand what the researchers are saying. And they don't implement that. So what we end up having is we have these this fragmented conversation. We have tools that address certain things maybe that a teacher wants, but that a researcher doesn't advocate for, and we don't have successful outcomes for our students. And so the difficulty with these guidelines, the things that we're going to have to work on together, and really while we're here, and I would say that this conference is doing an excellent job of bringing us together, and it's our job to keep the conversation going afterwards so that we can come up with guidelines that do make sense, people want to use, not only in terms of the teachers, but also in terms of the developers and the researchers, so that we start to make better decisions in the future. That's really what we want. We want better decisions so that the students learn more effectively.
Thank you, Avery. Santeri, would you like to add something to as an entrepreneur perspective or otherwise?
Yeah, well, more of as a general comment. So my background is also in teaching, so I tend to look through the teacher's eyes. But as sort of a general note, when I was yesterday evening once more looking through the guidelines or the draft, just felt like one of the biggest reasons why I'm very supportive of the idea is that it feels like when you ask from parents, you ask from teachers, educators, it feels like so many people are so lost still with how alien, for example, games as a media is for them, that overall just sort of educating the parents and the educators is a very, very worthwhile thing. Because I feel like I'm becoming one of the more stricter parents, for example, although I make this stuff. And I feel like sometimes some people that I see on the streets or that I meet should also, take more responsibility on, how their children, for example, are using media, and maybe that type of a guideline could be a good reference point for also the game developer to, what type of things are expected for me to create a powerful and useful experience, but also, a reference point for the parents, like, okay, what type of media I should be looking for my child, or as an educator, what type of media I should be looking for my students, what type of usage in terms of hours, in terms of purpose, things like that, would be most appropriate.
Thank you. Susanna, you are the last one who hasn't skimmed yet. In your fight, I want to say, to change the world with games, how can guidelines help?
Well, the first thing I thought of when I heard about guidelines and I heard about the effort that UNESCO MGIP was taking around building a learning hub was that this is actually, and that was focused specifically around game-based learning and other digital pedagogies, was that it's a really big milestone for the broader Games for Change community. Because as you said, and for 15 years, we've been advocating as a not-for-profit that games can be a powerful tool for affecting change across a whole range of world issues, whether it's raising awareness around humanitarian issues, more and more now happening in games and health. But the idea of games for learning is something that we feel very strongly in and have tried to bring different stakeholders together for the last 5 years at our own Games for Learning events. And the fact that UNESCO and MGIP are saying, basically with an interest to develop these guidelines, that it's not can games have a positive impact on learning, but yes they can, and they can play a significant role in delivering on SDGs. And we, and you as an organization, are going to help make that happen at a global level. That's significant. And I think how that gets enforced, well, how first the guidelines are developed, right, with stakeholders are going to be brought to the table to develop the guidelines so they are efficient and useful for the developers and ultimately for the end users, the teachers and the students, and how they get enforced and how they get discovered. I think there's a lot of steps that have to get to developing a useful set of guidelines administering it, and eventually, which is also part of our, I think, a challenge that we have, is how do educators and school administrations and departments of education become aware that these useful and approved games exist? So I think there's a sequential set of steps that will need to be considered, and hopefully in unison.
Thank you. Avery and Ananta, you've started talking about not only the guidelines themselves, but also the process of certification. Ananta, do you want to share with us your thoughts on how the process could or should go? The certification process, once the guidelines are set up?
Oh, I haven't really thought about certification. I'm still in a nightmare of guidelines.
Okay.
Getting that through the political process. But, you know, it's not that we are starting from ground-based zero, because there is a certification system that we can learn from. The ISO is one in terms of quality and stuff, but this one is this is a slightly bit more complex, actually. It's something that Susanna was just mentioned, kind of made me write a note, is that the guidelines can never be static. A lot of times, you know, we develop a set of guidelines, and then we, you know, wash our hands and we say that's it. And it does more damage within a couple of years. It becomes more of a constricting factor rather than a productive, useful factor. So that has to be built into the process, where those guidelines are continuously evolving, which means they need to be constantly evaluated and then taken back to the member states to be endorsed on a continuous basis. So that adds more to the nightmare, but it has to be built into that system so that it's always to have the flexibility. You know, one of the things that we always get caught, I call this guidelines institution. I'm using a political economy definition of an institution, which is rules and norms. So this is basically going to be rules and norms. And the problem when we do set up institutions is we forget about it. And very rapidly they become obsolete, and they have very high transaction costs. And the whole idea of institutions and creating of institutions was to reduce transaction costs. So these are things that we have to keep at the back of our mind when we develop these guidelines. The certification system would be an interesting one. I haven't had a time to think about it, but it's natural. You know, Professor Valu Kumari used those terms as a tandem, certification, guidelines and certification, because you need to have that certification process. At the hub, there is the scope for having a global certification process, but again, to become a global certification center, there must be some process. We haven't really researched that. And I think that's something that we will need to do very quickly, is to sort of see how did the ISO come about. And the ISO is not an intergovernmental body, apparently. It was an organization, but it was set up by the stakeholders. So that could be a process that we could take, because hopefully, as Avery was sort of highlighted, and it's extremely important, is that we must have all the stakeholders, the relevant stakeholders at the table right from the very start. That ownership has to be important, otherwise it just becomes another set of guidelines that nobody follows, even if it is recommended by the 109 member states. So those are important issues that we need to keep at the back of the mind.
Thank you.
Yes, in the certification process, when multiple stakeholders are involved, so emphasis has to be given on the process of making the digital resource in addition to certifying the product as well. Well, Another thing that I would like to emphasize is game-based learning is quite interesting, that we have been learning about it in game-based attacks when we study literature, read literature about cybersecurity. Well, this game-based learning is normally incentive driven, incentive in terms of scores, marks, or some points. This kind of learning engagement, while on one hand for a group of students might be very advantageous, but for a few of them it would become kind of a habit wherein they would just somehow try to get through the system to gain the marks, forgetting the enhancement of the skills. For example, you post something in Facebook or Twitter, and the people start looking for how many likes and how many shares. That becomes a kind of a habit, and they're so much engaged with it that they lose time in the process. And in addition to this, we have to also set forth in the guidelines somewhere saying the rewards or incentives or things of that sort should not be devalued. So just for the sake of, these days when you go to schools, it's unlike earlier, wherein every participant, every student gets some rank or the other. So it's seen in a different sense, that some score has to be given to somebody who attempts. So we have to take care of all these things when game-based learning is being brought into the market. And then let us be cautious, because we are dealing with generation who are given the best possible comforts by the parents, and they're never failed by teachers. They're not given any report card where it shows you got all zeros, but there will be a minimum grade where forget the sense of failure. And well, you can see most of the students, in spite of being given a great environment to learn, most of them, many of them, they're unhappy and an unsatisfied lot when it comes to, rating themselves as best. So they would not do so. Many of them of this generation kids. So finally, I would like to say, let us not drive, let this activity be not an industry-driven activity, but an activity which will support all of us in achieving SDG 4.
So carrying on from my colleagues' comments, I feel like during this conference, one thing that is all around us is there is so many stigmas around digital learning, games, and so on, and so many misconceptions, that I think that overall the guidelines, what it can provide is this one sort of positive signal, positive push that, you know what, the positives about digital learning and games outweigh the negatives by so many times that you definitely give it a go. Now, couple practical thoughts about the certification, and from the developer point of view that I want to point out here. Some of these, I'm sure that the people that are being, neck deep into building these are really very aware of, but just wanted to say them out loud, that I feel that from the positive side, definitely a game developer or a content developer who wants to create quality products, quality experiences, of course, recognition and recognition for quality that they're bringing, a stamp, like a certification, can be a really helpful thing. And also, it can support and provide guidance for the developer, but like I mentioned, also for the parents. But some sort of worries that I have is that obviously so many apps are created every day nowadays that I worry that at some point what might happen is that the certification process is flooded by tens of thousands of apps. Some may be very poor quality, some may be high quality, and that might prevent the high quality apps to get their very well-deserved recognition. Another thing is that since at some point, at some level, the guidelines will have a political influence, hopefully very little, but I hope that one of my worries is that hopefully the guidelines will not become sort of a political tool to guide the, the development of apps in the future. Because of course, I want there to be the freedom of choice for parents or for gamers or for educators, that they don't have to worry about getting politically biased solution experiences. And also, eventually, I hope that where there is a certification, and I'm sure that the certification will be very well respected, I hope that it's sort of a positive endorsement and not sort of a blockade for some very high quality game developers or content developers, that some schools would only take UNESCO stamped or certified content, and although there being, I'm sure, at least half of the quality content outside without the certification, maybe waiting for the certification, and because they just don't have that yet, they can't get in.
Thank you.
Great. I have a couple of things I want to respond to that I heard, which I think all are constructive additions to this conversation. One which is which we actually talked a little bit about yesterday, the question that the guidelines are not to dictate content, right? We're talking about the tools and the pedagogies that, that will help support the developers to make content that will benefit children, but that the guidelines are not necessarily meant to direct that. And I think that is an important statement and a position to make. At the same time, I think it also opens up this question of, at the point of certification, what qualifies as being fully certified, and are the levels of expectation are that there is a clear efficacy or evidence of efficacy, and to what extent would be deemed acceptable. And there are, I think, to what Santeri was talking about, levels of, I'll say levels of impact or levels of content and learning opportunities that digital game-based learning can afford, that might fall more in the vein of a teacher assist, right? Content that can open up dialogue, that can be used in the classroom setting, but on its own may not have the kind of curricular structure with it, but still might have a useful place in the classroom. And so what the guidelines or the certification might consider are different levels. You talked about ISO, which I'm not familiar with as a certification tool, but I am familiar with what is used in the U.S., which is Common Sense Media. And it's a parent-facing tool as well as a teacher-facing tool that kind of grades certain aspects of content, and it's not all focused on learning content. It's also addressed media and entertainment content, so a parent or a teacher can see what level of violence might exist within the in the media experience or the game, or what kind of positive social behaviors are demonstrated. And I think that kind of grading system might be able to be considered so that the certification can encompass a broader body of offerings. The second thing I wanted to mention is how prepared the teachers, the educators, are going to be ready for using the content that's going to be made available to them. And the question is, even now, does that exist? And I think one of the considerations within the guidelines should be about preparing the teachers to use all the tools that are being made available to them, because at the moment, not all teachers are. I mean, there are computer science teachers might be more equipped, but if we are talking about using these tools in math classes or social studies classes, environmental science classes, where we are not talking about, where educators may not be brought up within their own training to use these tools, that should be considered as part of the guidelines.
This is a incredibly complex conversation, and as everyone's talking, my brain is going left and right, and I'm trying to put together something that's going to be super coherent and perfectly clear, and it's going to be, you know, the exclamation point at the end of the sentence. And the problem is that it's really complicated. So one of the ways that we could put together a set of guidelines would be, for instance, working with researchers, and that's kind of what I alluded to at the beginning. But the problem with working with researchers is doing a research study takes between 2 to 3 years. And that time, between the time 2 to 3 years, you've got developers who have put out 2, 4, 10 different solutions in that period of time. And how are you going to use some kind of efficacy research to then grade all the new material that's come out? So you have kind of a disconnect between the research field, which is incredibly important for judging the value of educational tools, and the people who develop it. On the other side of things, I think that there's I don't know if it's a myth, I don't know if it's disinformation, but there is a belief that somehow educational technology is dominated by corporations. I think that there's probably an element that is true, but I come from Quebec. In Quebec, we have over 65 different companies that make educational technology, and we all are part of now association. We got together to work together, to share knowledge and to share experience, and so that we can turn out better products and also talk with different stakeholders like the Ministry of Education, and they've given us a lot of money to help them solve problems of how to get educational technology into the classroom more effectively. And of the 65 companies, I think it's something like around 60% of them are founded by teachers, former teachers and current teachers. And I think around 100% of them have teachers that are working as employees in their companies. So a lot of the educational technology that I am closest to, I understand that there are bigger organizations out there that do things differently, but in the small to medium-sized companies that I'm working with are really teacher-driven. And so there is a desire, a very pure desire to turn out very high-quality tools that teachers can use and students can use. So we have to balance the conversation between, yes, corporations do drive a lot of education technology development, but a lot of it is driven by teachers, maybe parents, students too, because we want the students to test it. So as I said at the beginning of my little comment here, it's not clear how do we get the researchers and the developers to work together. How do we make sure that the teachers that are involved in this process are being heard? It's complicated, and the conversation is going to keep continuing. That's why I'm so excited to be here. But I do not have a conclusive statement that's going to say this is the best way forward.
Ananta, would you like to to have a reaction on what Avery just said, or the important point I think that Susanna raised earlier about the content, the fact that the guidelines should be content neutral?
Well, I think I was alluding to that actually when I was sort of saying not to be policy prescriptive, and you know, my observation is that education is in fact more closely guarded by policymakers than any other sector. It's one that it's very sensitive. So if these guidelines are expected to have at least some value, we'll have to make sure that they don't get to content specification. I completely agree with Susanna in the sense it should provide these broad parameters that one could follow, but when it comes to the actual content, you could sort of say, I think the guidelines shouldn't be specifying what learning outcomes should be. What it should sort of say is that whatever that is being produced should specifically specify what learning outcomes are. But the guidelines are not going to say, you know, for maths, it has to be A, B, C, D. That's been prescriptive. You sort of say, most probably in maths, well, whatever that's been presented should have learning outcomes clearly highlighted within the module. So that's the broadness that it will go to. the one challenge I think, as Avery was pointing out, is research and the time lag between research and policy. But that's why I was saying that it has to be a dynamic set of guidelines which needs to be continuously updated with the latest research, so that that it doesn't become static and it just becomes more stifling. And I'm very, very appreciative of what Santori was highlighting, is that it doesn't become a barrier. And I don't think it should be a UNESCO guide. The guidelines would be, yes, it was driven by UNESCO, but if the member states adopted, which is the way that the high-level policy forum wanted it to go, then it is the member states. But we have to make sure that it doesn't become a bureaucratic nightmare, that good content, products are not getting through for some either political reasons or whatsoever. But the question I wanted to actually maybe have a discussion on is something that Susanna brought up, is that, so the guidelines can be general, but do we need to have within the broader set of guidelines specific subsections to teachers, to policymakers, in terms of how to use the guideline? I remember when we finished the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, we had the full report, but then we had specific sections on biodiversity, one on dry lands, one on water, and then one for the private sector, one for policymakers, so that whatever that was relevant to them was extracted from the big report and then was packaged for them. And I'm wondering whether there would be utility to do something like that, drawing from that guideline. So what would be relevant for the teacher? Some of the key stakeholders, the content development, what would be the most relevant? I don't know. I haven't thought about it, but it seems to be emerging from this discussion, as well as some of the earlier discussions we had during the high-level policy forum as well.
Thank you. When I say thank you for coming earlier, I was not just being merely polite, but thank you because we also count on you with your questions and your remarks to help us push the reflection forward. So if people have questions in the audience, they are extremely welcome.
Hi. My question is triggered a bit to Avery, a bit to Santeri, and the previous presenter in the previous one, the entrepreneur using AI. Can't these guidelines themselves be living, changing, dynamic, factoring in the impact that they are creating? As educators, as policymakers, you are crystal clear of what you want to achieve. You may not know how it is best achieved. And you know when something is going wrong. And you know when something is working. So, and I heard very carefully your worry about being prescriptive or being dictatorial or being suggestive, and then nobody is going to follow. But if it is AI based, if the inputs are taken from the global thought stream that is so well captured now, and if those inputs come to a constantly calibrating certification panel, so the speed of development worries you, that if it takes us 3 years to come up with certification guidelines, and no matter, God knows how much would have been developed in the interim. So those things might get kind of factored in. Just a thought, I know, it might be a really stupid thought, but I thought I'd share it.
Well, I guess if 193 countries will be, revising them a year, it's not going to be very flexible. But maybe there is opportunity for there being some sort of board or advisors who will be revising them now and then, maybe yearly, looking at the global landscape of what are the topics, how the values are changing. Obviously, the values and the contents and the sensitive topics, for example, that these contents can even cover are different in various parts of the world. So, but definitely I like the idea, because world is definitely changing much faster than the countries can come to conclusions.
If I understand correctly, your comments and question were concerning the use of artificial intelligence and the writing of these guidelines? Is that correct? How to use artificial intelligence?
Or suggesting that maybe you should.
Okay, so this is so new, well, at least for me and the work that we're doing, the idea of using some kind of artificial intelligence to help us make decisions. I think that the way that artificial intelligence can help us make decisions, it's a little like either a user or a content expert. When we make games, we don't always have an expertise in the content that we're making a game for. So what we do is we work, for instance, with a content expert, whether they be in math or science or in healthcare or whatever, and we have to make sure that we're working with that person so that we're making the right decisions. And the way that I envision the use of AI, it is very new to me, and this might change, but the way I look at it is a little bit like a content expert in helping us make those decisions so that we make more effective decisions based on use and also based on outcomes. So we can look at it from the user perspective, and then we can also look at it on an outcome perspective. What's happening to the learning outcomes from the use? It is a great question, and I don't have the answer yet, and I would love to continue the conversation.
Can I just like one very practical idea just came to my, if somebody wants to make a product out of this. So maybe, people are doing Google searches. There would be an AI that would be pointing, I'm sure that Google is already doing that, taking up the most frequently asked questions. Like for example in UK after Brexit vote, then after that, one of the most common Google searches was what is European Union? So maybe at that point somebody would have taken the initiative and built a piece of content or a game about explaining European Union. So maybe a tool like this could be one of the guidelines for the developers looking at opportunities to make impact.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, you brought up a very interesting question, because one of the things that we've been recommending is take an example for the IPCC. For those who are not aware of what it stands for, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Somewhere the authoritative scientific body that brings in every 5 years or so the latest research on climate change. But what they do now, I think, is outdated. They are outdated by 2 steps. I've written on this, is that they're still depending on a selected number of experts that are nominated by the countries. So you got about 1,500, 1,900 scientists, and sometimes even lower than that. They still are not got to the next step, which we should be doing, is doing it through what I call the crowd in the cloud, which means you have a smaller group of shepherds which are nominated by the governments, but they really open it up, because there are many, many experts working in this field who have published, who have written, and who've got things to say. We should encourage them. We haven't got to that part yet at this. What you're suggesting is now the second step, because AI, I think, would be able to harvest the kind of literature out there, going through Google Scholar, going through, open up the academic journals, the publishing companies that own those journals, and doing a word, content analysis, and you can harvest that literature much faster than even 5,000, 6,000 scientists. But still, once that's been harvested and processed with an AI algorithm, is then a group of scientists to then, as stakeholders. I think I need to change with times. So no longer just scientists, stakeholders. The different stakeholders should then use that to improve the what we have. So with the guidelines, that would be the case. And in response to Santosh, yes, if it every year, that's it. The transaction cost, it will just whittle down. The good news is they don't meet every year; they meet every 2 years. But I wouldn't even advocate revising these guidelines every 2 years. I would say every 5 years. But what they do have, if it becomes extremely complex and is extremely important, they set up an intergovernmental body which is a subsidiary organ of UNESCO, which has its own members, but of course from the member states. And then they report regularly. So they are monitoring that all the time. So the international IOC, the international something for the International Ocean Commission, the subsidiary body of UNESCO, but they oversee the health of the oceans and they report regularly.
Another question from the audience?
Yes, I have a question. I am from first row.
Thank you.
I have a question to all of the panelists that you raised the certification issue and somebody, they are worried about it, right, I think. But my question, why all of you are worried or intention for certification? What is going on in the existing situation? The developing country, Indian too, and other countries, they are developing science and other educational material, and they are making profit. And are they worried about the certification? Or there is any certification process? As far as I know, there is no. Then why do you think the certification issue for digital content, VR content, or artificial intelligence and like others? The investors and developer, they are thinking the $1 million business is lying for them. Let them come. Let them come. If they think they can provide good material for the learners for their development, then they will survive. Other will not able to survive. This is the business issue. Of course, I will suggest, Anand, of course, the world should have a guideline. Professor Balikubari mentioned it is seriously the two perspectives, health issue and addiction issue. And we cannot make our learners addicted in games and like others. The researcher, they are doing research, of course the researcher will be, and other things, another things, that law issue. In a study, they arranged a very nice session. They invited 2 lawyers from one US and then one from France. And they discussed about the law perspective. And it's a nice gathering. This conference of the beauty is nice gathering. They invited lawyers, they invited neuroscientists, they invited developer, they invented different people, and they are sharing about the ideas of each others. And by these, a guideline will be developed. And there should have a guideline from 2 points of view. And another thing, many of the countries, they are developing, the legislation point of view, the parliamentarian, they are formulating law for cyber security. And these issues can cover, I think, if it is helpful, then government will take decision. Maybe international perspective, UNESCO and MGI and other organizations will think for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Since you say it's, according to you, business issue, maybe Avery, you want to answer to that or give us your opinion on that?
So if I can summarize this, it's the question of the business investment in educational technology and game-based learning, and its impact or potential impact on the certification process. Is that about correct? Why? I think the benefit of the certification is twofold. One, it helps teachers to make decisions when presented with a lot of different choices. When you're a teacher, you sometimes don't know what is the difference between product A and product B, and you want to pick what's best for your students. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand the value of that product pedagogically to help your students most effectively. From a developer's perspective, we want to produce, and this is what I was trying to say earlier as teachers, I'm a teacher. I want to help teachers to teach their students more effectively. So my goal is to promote something that has value. And if I have a set of guidelines that not only can I follow, but then I can also explain to everyone, look, I'm following these guidelines. I'm doing it the right way. If you want to try my product, I would love to have you try it, and I would love to have you give me feedback. The benefits is there for both sides. I think everyone here wants that process. It's just a matter of how do you do it correctly, and I think that's the thing that we're struggling with. There have been a lot of people who have tried this in the past, and there should be the first step should be go look at everything that's been done in the past. Where did they all go wrong? Because most of them went wrong. And then try to come up with a very dynamic process that includes stakeholders so that we can put forth something that makes sense, not only from a theoretical side, but from a practical side, so that we can help teachers and developers make products that help improve student outcomes more effectively.
So a couple comments. So first of all, I hope that, of course, the certification process will be equal to for-profit companies and not-for-profit companies. So everybody has equal access, and schools can make the best choice out of everything that is available, whether that's free or not free. Also, currently, if I bring you an example from my own, when I follow my spouse, who's a teacher, there's just this massive flood of information that is available that no one can keep up. Some numbers that I've heard from India is that teenagers are spending almost 11.5 hours something on social media just to keep up with what's going on around them. And just, of course, we need to reduce that time. And the only way to reduce that time is to make information more sort of effective and more sort of compressed. And of course, one way of doing this is to curate things. So my spouse, for example, when she's looking for, let's say, what I'm going to do in the next handicrafts class, she might use 1 or 2 hours from getting the information for the class from already a curated content. So if the content would be curated and she would only go to online to find something, would probably take double time. And of course, no teacher who wants to live their life and at the same time have quality education for their class can afford that.
Ananta, is there something you want to add? Other question?
Yes.
Sorry?
One more question here. As for the global guidelines, and there is flexibility in India, NCERT, SCERT, they are naming the syllabus. And in the syllabus, the curriculum is based on something anti-social and so on. So that is creating a lot of problem. It's already mentioned that political reason, bureaucratic reason, and how to solve this flexibility. And that should be along with the Indian Constitution, not beyond the Indian Constitution. The curriculum or SRT, NCERT, they are preparing their own, apart from the Indian Constitution. It's a bad problem. Flexibility, it's a global guidelines, definitely, guidelines should be there, but harmony should be there. Thank you very much.
So the content, what is to be taught for a particular subject is not to be discussed in a platform like this, because it's something to do with the board. And yes, what you say is right. Constitution? Yeah, that is something to do with NCERT boards and So here, for instance, IIT Bombay has recently come up with an evaluation and assessment tool, instrument for evaluating digital resources. Any digital resource, any training material can be assessed using the set of parameters that they have mentioned. It's called LOB, Learning Object Evaluation Tool. So researchers have started publishing the tools, and this LOB has been evaluated by many people who have delivered digital training resources across the country in IITs and NITs. So people have started assessing. And what do you evaluate here? You not evaluate subject-wise, but you evaluate what are the learning, whether there are any learning objectives, whether there are any outcomes, and whether this is following that kind of an outcome. So the software developers, like Harry was saying, they'll mention for whom it is intended, who are the target audience, target learners, and what is the scope, and things of that sort. So it don't get into the finest details of the subject. Yeah, that is something to do with the NCERT board.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm afraid our time is over. I would love to discuss this further. So thank you very much to the speakers, to the public, and have a nice day.
Can we go to the breakout sessions, Coral 1, Coral 2, Coral 3, and then Eureka and Summit, the sea level? Yeah, everybody, breakout sessions are underway in the rooms that I've just mentioned. Again, I repeat, Coral 1, 2, 3, Eureka, Summit, and the others. Yeah, have fun.